Tonight we're in Rochdale, and welcome to Question Time. We're in the magnificent setting of the Victorian Town Hall of Rochdale. A special welcome to our audience here, a cross-section of the British electorate, who've come to question and debate with our panel. Our panel, of course, who aren't told the questions in advance. Tonight they are the Conservative Cabinet Minister Ken Clarke, Labour's Deputy Leader Harriet Harman, the Liberal Democrat peer Shirley Williams, the new Statesman columnist Laurie Penny, and the chef Antony Worrall Thompson. And Dion Webber has our first question, please. Dion Webber.
Would you be happy to be treated in hospital by someone wearing a full-face veil?
Would you be happy to be treated in hospital by somebody wearing full-face veil? A controversial debate going on about the NHS this very day. Harriet Harman.
I think that I'd want to see the faces of the people that were nursing me, treating me. I mean, of course, when you're in the operating theatre, you don't want to see anything at all, but they're wearing a mask. But I think the whole debate about the veil, whether it is the debate about whether or not people should be allowed to cover their face in court or whether they should be able to cover their face when they're teaching in school. I mean, I was sort of brought up at a time when we used to hear about the struggles of women in Turkey or in Egypt or in Algeria to not have to, or in Afghanistan, to not have to cover their face, to be able to choose not to. So I've always kind of been in solidarity with those women in the Arab world who've wanted the choice not to wear the veil. Now we've got, and cover their faces, now we've got women asserting the right of wanting to choose to wear the veil. I remember one time coming back on a plane from Qatar, and there was a load of women going on the plane with very, completely veiled. And then, one by one, they went to the toilet in the plane, and they came out in miniskirts. And, in one context, they were wearing the veil. In another context, they were making a different choice. I mean, I'm not comfortable with the veil. I would, I don't see why women have to cover their face outside the home. However, I wouldn't be for banning it in public places. I think there's a lot of things I disapprove of in relation to treatment of women, which I don't think should be the subject of a ban, like page 3 of The Sun, for example, but I don't think it should be banned. But I also think we have to be quite careful with this discussion, because actually, for me, it's a discussion about women's rights and women's autonomy. But a lot of people join in this debate out of Islamophobia, and I find that very ugly and poisonous, and I hope that's not a tenor of this debate at all.
Antony Worrall Thompson.
No, I wouldn't like someone wearing a veil treating me in hospital. I think it's one of those places, like going through security at airports, being a school teacher, being a police officer. There are areas where the veil shouldn't be allowed, and I think we need clear outlines or guidelines for these areas from government. I mean, we get confused, I think, between cultural and religious. The thing about wearing niqab is it's not religious, it's a cultural thing. It originated in Persia, it was picked up by the Muslims, and it doesn't have to be worn. In fact, as far as I'm aware, when you do your pilgrimage to Mecca, you're not allowed to wear a covering on your face. When you have daily prayers, you're not allowed to have covering on your face. So, to me, there are areas, as in the court the other day, where niqab should be removed. I do believe facial expression is a very important part of all sorts of life. And I just think, especially in schools, I think children can feel alienated from the other parts of the school if they have to wear these things. If they're taken off and allowed to be exactly the same as the other children, they're far more likely to integrate. For me, any woman should be able to wear what she wants at the right time. We can't dictate to male or female what you should wear in your own private life and going out to the shops and things like that.
Okay. Laurie Penny.
Well, The fundamental issue here is one of gender and one of race and religious discrimination. I think it is, the bottom line has to be that it is sexist for any man to tell any woman what she may or may not wear, whether that be a burqa or a bikini. And it is racist for any white person to tell any Muslim woman what they may or may not wear. And the debate right now about face coverings is playing on a trend of Islamophobia which is extremely worrying, which we're seeing more and more being pandered to by the tabloids. What is more worrying, however, is the fact that this campaign is not just going to affect Muslims and women who wish to wear the niqab or wear a full face covering. The campaign against the right to cover your face in various public places that is starting right now is eventually going to affect everyone. The Face Coverings Act 2014, which is coming in next year, is actually also about people's right to anonymity in public per se. That's something that's not been picked up on very much by the press.
And what about the specific issue of hospitals and the other ones that have come up, appearances in court and that kind of thing? Are there circumstances when you think people should be ordered not to go fully veiled?
Frankly, I think discussions about being treated in hospital or appearing in court, whilst those circumstances might individually be distressing, are an enormous red herring to allow us to discuss whether or not we should ban the niqab per se. And that discussion is itself brutally Islamophobic and deeply sexist, and whether or not it makes us uncomfortable, as Harriet said, I appreciate that there is a big question of women's rights and women's choice involved here, but the people who should be talking about choice and talking about what should be allowed are Muslim women and nobody else.
Okay. The person there with the watch strap on, you sir.
I think in healthcare, in hospitals, it's such a compassionate environment. You just don't want to be treated by somebody unless you can see that non-verbal communication. I think to have somebody looking at you with a full face mask on and they're telling you some quite serious health news, it just wouldn't be suitable at all.
And you think there's not an issue really for the NHS? They should, because they're now going to try and decide whether there should be a rule laid down for...
Yeah, I don't think it should happen. I mean, maybe they need to ask each individual patient, would they be comfortable having consultations in that case? But no, I just don't agree with it.
And you, sir, on the left here.
As long as the patient receives a high level of treatment, does it really matter how they dress? I mean, there's people in the world, in Syria right now, who don't even get a choice of medical treatment. I mean, I think it's totally diabolical that we should just discriminate against a person just because of what they're wearing.
And the person in front of you there.
I worry really about the reasons that the females want to wear the veil, because are we being Islamophobic about them wearing the veil, or are they being Christianophobic about the need to wear it? And I think sometimes it's done as a demonstration of their own strength of beliefs.
And is to be condemned because of that, or is to be in a tolerant society allowed because of that?
We've got to be very careful that it doesn't marginalise the different communities and different cultures more than is necessary.
Shirley Williams.
Well, we should remember, I think, that 50, 60 years ago, it was unacceptable for women to wear trousers at work in this country. And it was unacceptable for women 50 years before that to, for example, show their ankles. It's really important to recognise that a lot of this is a culture that passes on. And my own belief is that in the next 50, 60 years, we will see the disappearance of the hijab, but it will be a cultural shift as women become accepted as equals within the Muslim community. Having said that, two things to add. The first is that the Muslim Council of Great Britain, which is a thoughtful body, has specifically said that where there are specific reasons why the hijab would be inappropriate, there should be permitted to be, and Islam permits it to be, exceptional cases. So the one we talked about in the NHS could fall into that category, and probably does. And the second thing to say is that the absolutely crucial issue is getting across to our Islamic brothers and sisters that women are the equal of men. We've had a long struggle here in this country on the same issue, And they're having a long struggle too. And I think the only point that I would probably disagree with Laurie on, I agree generally with what she said, is that it isn't, unfortunately, just an issue for Muslim women. Muslim women often live in families which are very patriarchal, where the head of the house is a man who is going to lay down some of the rules over his daughters, for example, and that therefore it's a bit of an illusion to suppose that Muslim women on their own can decide this. It's got to be decided by both men and women within the community. So having said that, I'm against trying to ban it. I think that would be unfortunate, indeed foolish, and I think it's not something we try to do.
But you do think it's a sign of women, it's a demonstration of women's perceived inferiority to men?
Yes, I think it is to some extent.
And you don't agree with that? You think it's not that?
Oh, if somebody tried to make me wear a face veil against my will, they would quickly find it in an uncomfortable position. But I think there is a big difference between a choice to wear a garment and being forced to wear a garment, and that's the distinction we're not making here. Actually, the lady in the brown jacket hit the nail right on the head when she said, well, won't that make Christians and people feel marginalised? And that is the subtext of this discussion. It's whether or not everybody else will feel uncomfortable about women wearing face veils in public. And that, of course, is the issue that we're not talking about, but whether or not that really matters is what we need to be thinking about. Does it matter if we're uncomfortable, really?
You said in that pink shirt there.
I'm not too bothered about banning the veil, but as a healthcare worker, I think it puts a barrier between the patient and the healthcare worker, and there's no way, if I had the choice to wear a veil, there's no way I'd be wearing a veil.
Okay, and the person there on the right.
The Muslim women who wear the niqab, it's a religious reason why they wear it, not a cultural. It's their choice to interpret the Quran, and how they perceive it advises them to cover themselves. So it's their choice. It's a freedom of choice.
You think it really is a free choice?
It is.
What
They're
about
intellectual individuals.
What about Islamic schools requiring their pupils to wear burqas or niqab?
Those parents have made a choice to send their children to an Islamic school. There's guidelines they have to follow, and they're quite appreciative of that. Just like if children go to a Christian school, they have a ethos to follow, and that's what they do. So it is. Muslim women are intellectual women, and they make the choice. It's not about being held back.
Ken Clarke.
Well, I think we're all free to wear exactly what we like, so it would be utterly ludicrous to start legislating about what people wear or don't wear on almost any occasion, unless there's some overwhelming public reason for it. Personally, I think wearing the niqab is rather sad, that some woman is persuaded that she has somehow got to retreat from the world in this way. She's being ogled by men and has to retreat behind a veil. It doesn't fit with my concept of society, but I agree most of them choose to wear the niqab, and I wouldn't dream of kind of challenging or the religious beliefs or the cultural beliefs or whatever it is that lies behind it. So that's my starting point. The only exceptions I'd make, really, and a lot of people wear daft things, and I'm not a very snappy dresser myself, but I don't think there's anything that government should have anything to do with. There are a few things when you're doing things, you're relating with somebody when you should. I think the judge was right. I'm an old trial lawyer. The duty of the jury or the magistrates, whoever, is to try to tell sometimes which witness is telling the truth, which is lying. Are they telling the whole truth? Someone trying to deceive me? You can't do that if the person is invisible apart from their eyes.
So should you have no blind jurors?
When blind jurors have developed their own techniques, of course, we don't know what our techniques are individually that tell us whether we trust what someone's saying or not. It's something to do with their body language, their facial expression, their demeanour. But if they put themselves on a sack, I wouldn't like to really judge what they say. Similarly, in the hospital, I think I've never seen, this is all getting rather overblown and loaded with too much principle. I've never seen a nurse wearing a niqab, and I was a health minister for many years, and I've been to an awful lot of hospitals. If she was taking my temperature, or if she was giving me my pills, or checking my charts, I think it's rather a pity that some woman's decided she's got to live like this in today's world of equality for women. But I wouldn't mind. If she's discussing my symptoms, if she's trying actually to relate with me, I think she would. I think it's quite important she's not wearing a veil. But one problem with overloading it with all this vast significance, as though suddenly we're going to have lots of nurses wandering around with kneecaps on, is it encourages this Islamophobic element to the discussion. Now, I deplore the Islamophobia much more than the kneecap, and we've got to be careful about it.
Okay, a couple of our panellists said it's up to people what they wear or whether they wear nothing. I was out walking the other day, and I passed the Naked Rambler. You know the Naked Rambler? I was on the Downs, and this completely naked man, except he had walking boots, came down, and I said good afternoon, and I looked at him afterwards. He'd been jailed for 6 years over his lifetime for walking around naked, which seems to me...
Goes on doing it.
He does go on doing it, yes, perfectly harmless.
Well, we should have said,
quite
wear
surprising.
what you like, as long as you're decent. Yeah.
Let's go on. Oh, now look, just before we go on to the next question, you can join in the debate, as you know, from home, either texting us or twittering us. Both are very popular. Our hashtag is BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. You can text comments to 83981. If you push the red button, you'll see what others are saying. Let's have another question. This is from Sean Geeling, please.
Should the children of wealthy parents get free school meals?
Should the children of wealthy parents get free school meals? In the light of the Liberal Democrat Nick Clegg's announcement this week that all 5-, 6- and 7-year-olds would get free school meals, regardless of the income. I have to declare a slight interest because my son co-authored the report which was behind this announcement. Having said that, let's go to the discussion of it. Laurie Penny.
Well, this all comes down really to what sort of country we want to be, doesn't it? Talking about universal free school meals, I really support any universal benefits. I support the principle of the common good, and I think one of the most important pieces of common good in this country is the idea that all children should be well fed and healthy. Yes, maybe some people who don't necessarily need free school meals will be receiving them, but I think much more important is that we all collectively put in for the health and the future prospects of our children. I don't have any children myself, and I would be delighted to pay towards the future of the nation's health and to ensuring that 5-, 6- and 7-year-olds get a decent meal at school. Hopefully it would be decent. I mean, I do remember school.
But if half the country can afford to pay it, why should that be subsidised by the taxpayer when times are tough? And it's going to cost 600 million, I think, a year.
Because the principle of universal welfare is bigger than whether or not any individual family can or cannot afford a certain benefit. And also there are lots and lots of children who fall through the cracks right now, people who are not necessarily signed up for free school meals but nevertheless go to school hungry. Food poverty is massively on the increase in the UK, and that's something we all need to worry about.
OK. Shirley Williams. Incidentally, if any of you teach in school or are parents of children of this kind of age in school, do let's hear from you. Shirley Williams.
Absolutely, yes. The study that was done behind this decision, which you will be familiar with, David, for the reasons you said, showed that children who get free school meals consistently outperform children that don't. Now, one of the reasons for that is that something like 40% of parents never claim a school meal that they're entitled to because they feel themselves to be held up, or their children to be held out, as needy. So they don't even claim it. Very often the poorest parents are among those who don't claim it. Secondly, we should be quite honest and say that a lot of kids get to school who've not had a proper breakfast, won't get a proper lunch, not necessarily because their parents are poor, but because their parents are stressed, and in some cases trying to hold down 2 jobs at the same time, and nobody gets around to feeding the kids properly. So there's a third reason, and it's a very important one, for 6- and 7-year-olds, and Laurie's right about this, to grow up healthy and to grow up with a proper diet. Essentially, it's crucial that they get free school meals and no distinctions are made as to what one kid is entitled and what kid is not. And I repeat, many, many parents don't claim because they can't like to see their children singled out. It's a very good thing.
When Southwark Council did this, Simon Hughes opposed it. I mean, I've got this wonderful poster here that Liberal Democrats produced, Labour's Bad Choices. Southwark Council leadership, we've only run the council since May, millions for free food for the richest kids.
Well, it's a big mistake, and I think Simon is not a parent, and if he was, he would never have made those statements.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, really.
What's it, by not having children, he's out of touch with...
Yes, what happens is, if you don't realise this extraordinary non-economic fact that many parents don't claim free school meals, and you don't realise that if you're not in schools where it happens, you make remarks like Simon's done. But I'm not going to try to defend. I'm a great believer in Simon. He's an excellent MP. But I think that was a big mistake, and I think it was one that he probably now would change his mind about.
OK. You sir in the white shirt up there.
Yeah, I'm a teacher here in Rochdale, and quite often at the school I work at, Shirley Williams is absolutely right that children don't come to school having had breakfast, and quite often the first meal they have is at lunchtime. So, to me, it would have made more sense to serve free breakfast rather than free meals at lunchtime.
OK. And the woman in the middle there. Woman there in the middle.
There have been huge cuts to children's services this year and job losses, with further cuts proposed by the Chancellor for 2015. Do you not think the money could be better spent?
What do you think it could?
I definitely think it could.
Antony Worrall Thompson.
Well, I think if you've got to make cutbacks in these hard times, it shouldn't be on food, because I do think the implications are huge. These children are not getting fed properly, whether they're rich or poor. There's so much bad attitude to food going on. There's so many kids living on junk food, and so many kids really don't get enough to eat or the right sort of food to eat. And Shirley's right, it's about a stigma. It's not about rich and poor. It's about the poorest people feeling different because they're getting free meals at the moment, when their colleagues, their schoolmates are having to pay. And I think, I mean, to me, when I was at school a long time ago, and we got one meal, we had a teacher sat at the end of the table making sure we ate it, and we were all very healthy. The big problem we've made in the past about school meals, in my opinion, is giving kids choice. Because we know when they have a choice, they make the wrong choice. It should be a fixed meal. I'm sounding a bit radical, I know. It should be a fixed meal, apart from obviously religious belief, etc. like that, vegetarians. And all kids should just learn to appreciate food as it's given to them.
Learn to love cabbage and spinach.
Well, yes, because the more you feed them, the more they will enjoy it.
It's like force-feeding chickens.
It's not force-feeding. It's about a sense of discipline. It's about a sense of table manners, all sorts of things.
OK, you say in the orange there.
I work in a school, and we run a cashless system, so there's no stigma. Nobody knows who's on free school meals and who's not. And I think it'd just be a complete waste of money to spend money that we don't need to in these times.
Do you have parents who do pay and parents who don't pay?
Yes, and they all run on a cashless system, so unless the children tell each other whether they're on free school meals or not, nobody is distinguished from anyone else.
Ken Clarke, are you in favour of this? And was it a trade-off, as we read, between the married couples' tax allowance for the Tories and this one for the Liberal Democrats?
I don't think so, because the married couples' transferable tax allowances, I hope, was already in the coalition agreement. So,
but it hasn't exactly come into effect,
I must admit, I don't altogether know. But
why don't you know?
Well, because I don't know exactly what led to the background of it being announced at the Liberal Assembly. We are in a coalition, and the Liberals seem to be claiming all the credit for this. I mean, I don't buy this principle of universality, which has been taken too far in the benefit system. I mean, cash, it's silly. With far too many things, we hand out cash to people who we say are so wealthy they must pay high rates of tax, but so poor we've got to give them money to do something else. And that's one of the things in reforming it we're tidying up. But we have given free food to everybody in hospital for as long as I can remember, and so it's not breaking new ground here. Quite a lot of rich people get free food if they're treated by the NHS.
As a former Chancellor, what do you make of the Chancellor spending 1.2 billion when we've got this deficit?
Well, you've got to make a case for it, and we obviously have got to find the money from somewhere else, because we mustn't start sort of just deciding it doesn't matter anymore to cut debt and deficit. Well,
but an election coming up...
That's Ed Ball's problem.
An election coming up, there's a bit of spending, is that right?
Well...
Would that be the answer?
We have controlled debt and deficit quite spectacularly. We've saved the country from disaster. It doesn't mean you don't do anything new, you stop spending money on anything, but you do have to have a case for spending money, and you have to work out where the money is coming from. I think the best case is the one made by Shirley. It does seem to me it's quite clear that quite a lot of people who would qualify for free school meals if they knew about it and applied for it, don't. And so that must be a good reason. The other reason, I hope is right, there is this report. That's what's caused it. And if it be the case, I think not that they outperform the better off pupils, sadly. That's one of the problems. People from deprived backgrounds tend not to do so well as their better off colleagues. But if the improvement in the performance of children is very pronounced, and if 5-year-olds to 7-year-olds, the most crucial years, you can improve the start they make in school, then in my opinion, yeah, it's worth 400 million. I wouldn't extend it to primary schools, which Nick Clegg is already sort of cheerily telling us going to do, which costs an old chancellor would say a fortune to do that, unless someone evaluates it. I mean, let's evaluate it. If we've found that you can improve the performance of children by making sure they all get a sound, balanced hot meal, then you'll find the public will demand it gets spread through the system. So start with the ones where it matters most, their start in school. Let's see whether we get value for money, but it's worth trying.
And the person up there, in the second row from the back.
My children are grown up now, but as they were growing up, I wanted to make my own decision about what they ate, and I would make sure that they had a balanced diet, and that I would make meals for them that I knew that they would eat, whereas often when they had school meals, they would leave it and not eat it. So I always wanted to make sure that they had an adequate meal that I had prepared for them myself, and I feel that this policy takes away the choice of the parent to decide for themselves what the children shall eat.
So you would resent it if it was compulsory
Yes.
to eat the school meal. And the woman in the third row here.
Why not subsidise school meals for all primary school aged children instead of just 5, 6 and 7?
All primary
Yeah,
schools?
subsidise instead of offer free meals for those 3 years and subsidise it across the board. So it's cheaper for all primary school years.
Harriet Harman.
Well, I think it is a good idea to introduce free school meals for all children in infant schools. And, you know, I think there's a lot of gut instinct here that would tell you that when you see all the kids, you know, as Antony has said, sitting down together, you know, some of them learning to use knives and forks in a way that they don't necessarily at home, and actually having the collective experience of all sitting down and eating together, I think that that is very important. And I think Ken's right that there are children whose parents are entitled to free school meals but don't claim it, and then those children suffer. And therefore I think on health grounds, and obviously there is a real impetus for ensuring there's not only, you know, attractive, desirable food, but also healthy food to tackle obesity and to get them into good eating habits. And also there's educational grounds as well as health grounds. But I hope that, you know, they say it's going to cost £600 million. I hope they won't actually take that money away from schools, away from the children's centres that they're already closing. And I've got a suggestion, which is that if they, instead of taking it away from other children's services, they ought to reverse the tax cut that they've introduced for people who are earning more than £150,000 a year. That would be the way they could finance it, and I think that that would be a very good change. But the other thing is, I hope they won't be on a quid pro quo with the Lib Dems saying that they want free school meals, which we support. Then the Tories get their way to introduce the married man's tax allowance. I mean, really, the idea of giving a tax allowance, this is what's supposed to be the deal. The Lib Dems got the free school meals, and then the Tories at their conference the week after next are able to announce that there's a tax allowance. The idea that people will get married for the sake of, you know, £150 a year, or stay happy in their marriage for the sake of £150 a year. The idea that it can go to a man on his third wife, but not to the 2 wives bringing up his children, the previous wives. The thing is absolutely ridiculous. So I think we need to have evidence-based support for children and families, and, you know, not the married man's tax.
Very briefly on this. Be brief if you would.
I couldn't help saying I don't know how many times Harriet and her colleagues have spent that 5% cut we made in the top rate of income tax, which incidentally they never imposed actually when they were in office. They only announced it just before the election. It gets spent over and over again. But
on the married couples allowance?
On the married couples allowance, well, it was in the coalition agreement. I don't think there has been a horse trade. It's going to come in the autumn statement. I think there is a case for a transferable tax allowance where you have a non-working wife. If you have a couple, we're going to spend so much, quite rightly, on childcare to help the one that goes to work, Why shouldn't the woman who chooses? It's a woman's perfect liberty to choose. They're both quite authentic choices. She chooses to miss more of her career, stay at home looking after her children. Why can't her tax allowance be transferred?
Or vice versa, Laurie Penny.
Or vice versa, spouse, not just husband.
If you think it's so important for women to stay at home whilst they're raising their kids, then why are you penalising single mums by making them go back to work earlier?
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense.
I wasn't saying it's important. I was saying it's entirely a woman's right to choose in a couple. When you have a couple, most couples nowadays, they will both go to work. Some couples, the spouse, usually the wife, prefers not to. And if you're doing so much for childcare, quite rightly, to help the working mother in a partnership, then why don't you actually allow the tax allowance to be transferred?
This is a subsidy for stay-at-home mums, basically.
No, well, you just... I don't know what... Are you objecting to married couples getting equivalent tax allowances to people who, you know, get it as married couples if their child goes out?
What if they live together? What if they live together and they're bringing up children but they're not married and they would then not get that married couples allowance? I don't think the state has got any... business actually telling people whether they should get married or stay married. I think that basically they should be supporting families and children. And you should be in a coalition with me on this, Ken, because I know you don't agree with this. He doesn't.
Well, they're all married. Well, the old married couples allowance I tried to get rid of when I was Chancellor. That was a reward for being married. I got rid of the first half and Gordon got rid of the second. That was, there was an agreement there. But what we're talking about here is the support you give to people with children. The one difference between married couples and just partnerships, I do have to accept, is it's easier to deal with married couples because you're certain there's a partnership. You have a definite way of giving tax relief and not giving tax relief. You can do it with couples, but it's far more difficult to work out whether a couple are really in a settled relationship.
All right, let's go on to another point. Sean Stafford, a question from Sean Stafford, please.
Does reducing the housing benefit of people with a spare bedroom help to address the housing shortage?
Does reducing the housing benefit because people have a spare bedroom, the subsidy or tax, depending on your view, actually address the housing shortage? Shirley Williams.
Not much, I don't think. I suspect that this is one of those things that is a mistake. Will have to be corrected. But let's be quite blunt about it. The basic problem is that we have a great many people who are desperately waiting for housing. Thousands upon thousands of them. We have got a totally inadequate housing programme. And although it was controversial at the Lib Dem conference, my own view is that we should have a bigger housing programme. How that's financed, whether it's financed by, for example, local authorities being allowed to borrow more, which is a very contentious issue because there's not much control over it, or whether it should be funded by raising money in other ways, for example, by the mansion tax, which my party is strongly in favour of, is for me something that I think is less important than actually putting more money behind the building of social housing.
On the bedroom tax, do you regret that Nick Clegg wasn't able to stop it happening?
Yes.
Was there opposition to it within the Liberal Democrats?
Yeah, there was great.
Did
there's a great deal of argument about it, but the crucial point is that it's the wrong way to address it. It's not so much the bedroom tax; it's the failure to produce enough social housing. And I would repeat that I think the only way you can do that, and incidentally, it also gives jobs to many youngsters who are now studying as apprentices, construction trades, who need jobs at the end of that process. The only way to deal with it, I think, is to recognise that we have to finance a much, much bigger housing programme with a very substantial part of it social housing.
Harriet Harman.
Well, I don't think it does address the housing shortage, and I think the idea that there's all these people on the waiting list, which there are, and then all these homes would be freed up because people would be financially incentivised to move. The problem is that where are these one-bedroom places for people who are in two bedrooms to actually move into? And the thing is that the government knew at the time that it's not a question of people just refusing to move to smaller homes, is that the homes aren't necessarily there. And therefore, I think the effect is very harsh, it's very unfair, the whole basis for it is wrong, and I think the government not only should never have introduced it, but actually, and we voted against it, but as the evidence mounts that it's plunging people into arrears, many of whom are falling behind in their rent for the first time in their lives, which is a terribly anxious and worrying thing for people. I think it's shameful that they're saying we're going to solve the problem of the public debt by forcing your family personally into debt. I think it's absolutely shameful.
Is there a Labour commitment to reverse it?
Well, there's a Labour commitment to calling on the government to reversing it now and not waiting till 2015 as the evidence mounts up of the hardship it's causing for people. But come the next general election, if they haven't actually reversed it, you'll have to see in our manifesto what we actually put forward. But we are campaigning now, and I'm glad that Shirley's said that the Lib Dems made a mistake on it. I mean, you know, I'll just give you one small example.
Let me just interrupt you. It's very easy to say we're opposing the government, the coalition now, and you'll have to wait till 2015 to see what we put in our manifesto. When the manifesto comes, you're dealing with what you would have to do in government.
Yes.
And you're hedging your bets here, because you're not saying,
no,
and we absolutely will get rid of it.
No, I think it's perfectly...
Well, you aren't saying you'll get rid
I
of it,
think
are you?
What I'm saying is I'm not going to say what's in our manifesto, but it's perfectly obvious what we think about the bedroom tax. We voted against it. We've brought forward votes in the House of Commons for them to drop it now. We think it's absolutely iniquitous. And I'll just give you one sort of example.
But you voted against every other aspect of welfare reform, Harriet, and you haven't committed yourself to reversing any of them.
Well, you know,
you just
we
always vote against any saving expenditure.
We're voting
on Social
against
Security.
the bedroom tax because we think it's unfair. And I'll just give you one, without going into absolutely loads of anecdotes, which many people of my constituency have found so many problems with it. Leave aside all the administration with all these bedrooms being measured as to whether or not they're a box room or a, you know, something else, not really a bedroom. There's one woman who has epilepsy, and she doesn't have fits, you know, every week all the time. But when she does have a fit, her daughter comes to stay with her in her spare bedroom till she gets kind of back on her feet and sorted again. And she said, I suppose I'll have to find a one-bedroom flat to be moved into. But if I do, my daughter will not be able to come and stay with me when I have an epileptic fit, her daughter who lives outside of London. And therefore I'll have to have help from social services. I mean, why don't we have support for families and communities that are working together rather than saying... And also on the mansion tax... But just let me... Just one point on the mansion tax. I must say this point, because it's really such double standards.
We're not talking about the mansion tax.
If you're under-occupying a mansion, you have to be protected from the mansion tax. If you're in a council home and you're under-occupying, you have to be chucked out or have your rent put
You,
up.
sir. Yes.
I'd like to ask Harriet Harman as whether she would call on Labour councillors not to evict people from their homes, and sort of, especially if they're on job seekers allowance, because you actually get the situation where they're sent letters saying that you are allocated the minimum amount to live on, yet expected to pay the bedroom tax and council tax. I know in this area, Rochdale Council actually charges people 25% on Band-Aid properties of their council tax.
And this is a Labour-controlled council?
It's a Labour-controlled council, yes.
Harriet Harman, just on that point.
Well, I think that the Labour councillors have been absolutely horrified by the imposition of the bedroom tax and it pushing people into arrears. But obviously, they have to run the legal rules as they are, which is why we think central government that's imposed this should actually reverse it.
All right.
And, you know, Labour councillors are all totally opposed to this.
So you don't blame them. The woman on the left here.
Well, I worked in a homeless section, and what I found were there were 40 or 50 people waiting for 4 houses, and then they'd become, as they were waiting and realising there were not, it felt like there was no end to their situation. So then the mental health services were needed, and social services had to come in to try and deal with the situation. We're just going further and further down due to no housing being available.
Ken Clarke.
Well, the obvious first way to tackle housing shortage, which we certainly have, is to build more houses. So I won't go into the government's busting every gut to try and get house building up from the collapse of the house building that's occurred in this country in the recession we inherited. It is obviously more tricky when you start dealing with over-occupied houses. But, I mean, the moment it gets more difficult, there's no point in retreating. There are lots and lots of people who cannot get accommodation for themselves and their families. And it's all the harrowing marginal cases that are cited. Somebody who's just sitting in a property that is really far too big for their needs, but says they sometimes want to put their relatives up, should not be paid more by way of housing benefit than somebody who's living in something of the right size. That is what we did. Everybody, even the example that Harriet gave about somebody, their daughter sometimes visited, so that's what the empty room was for. Well, it's very nice, but should the taxpayer pay you extra money for that empty room when someone's waiting for bigger accommodation? She added the epileptic attacks to make it appealing. But actually, no, I'm sure genuinely, no, I'm sure truthfully.
Ken, you're a hard man.
I'm not a hard man. It's very nice to have spare rooms, but it was always an anomaly, actually, when you're reforming welfare, you look at it and you ask yourself, logically, why do we pay people more housing benefit if they've got empty spare rooms that they don't actually need? Why do those people get more benefit than somebody who's living?
Housing benefit goes directly to private landlords, and if we want to reduce spending on housing benefit, then we need to be instituting rent controls right now to stop money going into. I'm sorry, this is ridiculous.
I must be doing well. You're trying to get me off the point. That's being changed as well, paying direct to landlords. The fact is, the rules were you got extra money if you had rooms that you didn't really need. And that's been changed. Now, what happens is the Labour Party always oppose any reductions in welfare. Of course, they don't promise to reverse them all, because they know perfectly well they haven't the first idea how they pay for them if they were lump the responsibility. The Liberals are persuadable, and they're in the centre ground. They are persuadable to join us, but once they get near the Liberal conference, they start going wobbly again, and they decide they might want to spend the money again.
No, in all fairness,
if you're reforming, you and I are marvellous coalition partners on 90% of the time, Shirley. But
this is 10% of the time.
A Liberal conference has a bad effect on me, makes me go wobbly. It is logical what we're doing. We shouldn't have had extra payments for spare bedrooms, that we don't apply it to pensioners, we don't apply it to people where there's a medical reason for it, but there are a lot of people out there who can't get a house, they're on the waiting list, they've got kids, and they can't get somewhere that's big enough for them, and there are people sitting in big accommodation being paid extra benefit for having the empty room.
Thank you. The woman in red there.
Can I ask Ken Clarke what he thinks now about Margaret Thatcher's policy of selling off the council houses in the 80s and never building any to replace them?
It was the second part of the comment.
I was a keen supporter. Margaret wasn't too keen. Margaret had to be persuaded. It was Peter Walker's policy, really, and there's a guy who ran Birmingham Council who started it. Margaret thought it was quite wrong to give a discount on the market rate when we were selling to the sitting tenant. We had to explain, or I didn't do it, but Peter somehow managed to get across to her that there was a sitting tenant discount. It was a great breakthrough. It was extremely important. It gave people the chance of owner occupation who would never otherwise have had it. The old mass council house building, some of those, some have been modernised, some very nice, but those awful estates that were the main form of house building that went on outside every city in the country, thank heavens we got rid of that.
Okay,
that was old-fashioned.
Her question was, and not allowing them to... Her question, though, was, and not allowing them to build another house to replace the ones that they had to sell. That's the key point that she was...
Well, I just said this in the housing stock. The councils, shortly before we came in then, had started building these awful tower blocks. They were getting frightfully keen on building workers' tower blocks of the sort that we had in Eastern Europe, and we started suddenly coming into all our cities. Most of them had to be pulled down by now. The idea that the old councils were the right house builders...
One sentence.
Yes, one sentence, Shirley, and then I want to go to this gentleman.
I was a member of Parliament for a new town, Stevenage, and what actually happened was that most of the new towns moved to the Conservatives after this proposal. But Harriet's right. If the money had gone into a Treasury fund to finance new housing, it would have been all right. As it was, it simply took whole chunks out of the housing stock, and that was a disaster.
The man in the blue shirt there.
I think what, for instance, Ken Clarke doesn't realise is that when people have to pay the the bedroom tax, it works out roughly about 20% of somebody's actual income. What I'd like to see is, I think Michael Portillo may have done it previously, but Ken Clarke to actually spend a week living on benefits and then see how he's able to cope with the amount of money what you actually receive.
I agree with that.
I think you would find it an interesting experience.
He says he agrees with that. All right, you agree. Let's leave it there.
It's not a tax. You don't pay anything. Your benefit goes down to the level somebody else gets who's living in the accommodation they require. That's not semantic.
Well, it is semantic. If you had a bit of money and then it's taken away, most people would say it's a
That's why the transition, changing from one to the other is the difficult bit.
Laurie Penny.
That's why it's £180 million to ease the hardship of transition.
It is outrageous that the Tory party and the Lib Dems in coalition with them are being allowed to quibble and mince words over the bedroom tax, which has been a fiasco from the start. For the government, it is an embarrassment, but for at least 180,000 people living at the very margins of our society, it is a catastrophe. You do not understand, well, clearly, because of your comments earlier, you don't really understand what it's like for people to live with long-term disabilities. I'm sure there are several people with disabilities in this audience right now. These are people who are being hammered not just by the bedroom tax, but by welfare cuts, by ESA, which, by the way, Labour brought in. And I think the one point I do agree with Ken Clarke, surprisingly on this panel, is that Labour definitely need to be coming back and opposing these welfare cuts and saying that they would not support them in office. I think there are a lot of people on low incomes, because most people receiving welfare benefits are in work. There are people on low incomes and people who are jobless who feel let down both by the Conservatives and by Labour right now, who see no option out there, nobody fighting for them. It's an absolute outrage.
You want to answer that you're not fighting?
Well, I can understand Laurie's frustration, and it is very frustrating being in opposition, but we are absolutely standing up for the people who are suffering from the bedroom tax. And the point is, if you can't move, your income goes down, and it can be down below what you really should be entitled to have to live on. So it's going to make people very, very hard.
Antony Worrall Thompson.
I mean, all this bickering just drives me mad. I mean...
Which bickering?
Well, everyone.
What do you mean, argument?
Bickering, they're having an argument, but then nobody's coming to any conclusion.
No, these things matter.
But the conclusion is building new houses. That's the answer. We have to relax planning laws. But, you know, we can't just look for brownstone sites. We've got to go out and build. And it's as simple as that. Isn't it sad we've got to a stage where we're telling people that they've got to move out of their own homes or get less benefits, their own homes, which they built all their possessions around, and they've been told they've got to go or get less benefits. I mean, we're not running a prison society here. We have to respect that people have homes, whether they're government homes or their own homes. I mean, this to me is completely iniquitous tax. I'm normally a Tory, but on this occasion, I'm definitely not.
Okay. Time is that the sands are rushing out. I want to take a question from Steve Mullington, please. Steve Mullington. Bit of hard politics here.
Given the likelihood of the 2015 general election being another hung parliament, should Nick divorce David and remarry with Ed next time round?
OK, if it's a hung parliament. All right, Antony Worrall Thompson, you started actually, but yeah, go on.
I knew you'd do that. Well, I mean, Nick will choose anyone that's going. I mean, you know. Let's be honest, I mean, I've just been talking about bickering. Well, I mean, the Liberals bicker. You know, you've got Vince Cable at everyone's throat, stirring up all sorts of things. I mean, they haven't got what it takes. Let's be honest. the grassroots need to stop bickering as well, because it's the only chance you're going to get to govern is in the next year and a half. You're never going to get another chance. Forget it. The Liberals are finished. I'm sorry about that. Sorry, Shirley. I'm sorry. But, you know, you can't have disunity in a coalition. You can't have Vince Cable calling Tory policies ugly when he votes for all of them. You know, he hasn't had a non-vote since 2010. So he's voted for everything that's gone through. So, to me, he will choose Labour. If Labour have got more people, he'll run scampering off to Labour. God forbid.
OK. Shirley Williams.
I think Antony should get back to his kitchen.
Because you don't like what he says?
No, I don't. I think also it's terribly unfair. Oh. Look, Nick Clegg has stood up to colossal damnation by the media. Read the Daily Mail if you don't believe me, any day of the week.
Yes.
It took guts to actually decide that the country's economic situation, and I'm not going to go into who was responsible, whether it's the banks or the government, that's a matter for you to decide. But it was a hell of a situation. And in that hell of a situation, one of the very few things that enabled this country to actually maintain a low interest rate, to stop having a scare that would have driven sterling out of the world markets, was to see a government that would work together and that would actually have a majority. We have a government that has a majority, that works together, though, as you can see, Ken and I don't always agree. But let's not kid ourselves. The very great strength that managed to get us through from the crisis to where we now are, a gradual recovery, only gradual, but it's coming, was because governments and parties were prepared to work together in that situation, almost like in wartime. And it's such a cheap remark to make that Nick Clegg would take on anything he likes. That guy has stood up for things he believes in. I don't always agree with him, but he's stood up for things he believes in the face of tremendous storms of anger and protest. He gets beaten up all the time. He stands up. He never makes personal remarks. He doesn't lay into other people. He tries to go on saying what he believes and what he thinks he's standing for. And I take extreme resentment at what Antony said, and I hope he'll go back and make himself a nice meal and keep out of this area.
Pop at Vince Cable. I mean, to be fair,
all right.
He's had to be part of the coalition, but there seems to be this in-house bickering between the Liberals, within the Liberals.
Is the argument, Shirley, is the argument...
anti-Tory Europeans?
Is the argument Nick Clegg has put forward that the reason to vote Liberal Democrats is to stop Labour ruining the recovery, economic recovery, and the Tories being unfair? Do you think that's the right argument? And do you think the Liberal Democrats are an essential part of government now? And which way, one last question, would you like to see him go next time?
Well, I'm not going to fall on the last one, because that would be very foolish. I think it's a matter where a great deal will depend on who gets a plurality. In other words, if Labour gets a plurality, the arguments will be ones that Labour will put to a potential coalition partner. If the Tories do, it'll be a set of very different
You'd have
arguments.
no objection either way, though,
no,
a principled objection?
Of course I do, but I'm not going to say so, because it's totally unhelpful.
You'd rather be with Ken or with Harriet?
No, I think it's I like them both.
Harriet Harman.
Well, I think, obviously it's called a coalition, but it certainly feels and looks to us in Parliament every day when we're voting that there's Tory proposals, whether it's, top-down reorganisation of the NHS or trebling tuition fees or putting up VAT or all the other things that we've been talking about. There's Tory proposals, cutting the rate of tax for millionaires, and then the Lib Dems go and vote for it. And I feel that it's not so much coalition as collusion by the Lib Dems in what the Tories are doing. And, Shirley talked about the great strength of this, of them being together in the sake of the economy. The fact of the matter is, because they pulled the plugs on the economy, cutting spending so far and so fast, it created austerity, which created the situation getting even worse. We've had 3 years lost stagnation into the economy and the slowest ever recovery. So I don't even begin to agree with the basics that it's been somehow good for Britain what has actually happened since the Tories got in. And I think that it is absolutely bizarre that the key policy for Nick Clegg at the moment appears to be that whoever's won the election and him coming third, that he's still got to be Deputy Prime Minister. That seems to be the one policy above all that seems to stand out.
You agree with what Ed Miliband said when he was running for leadership, that he would not not go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats. You agree with that as a position for the party?
He said he wanted us to have an overall majority so we can put our position to the electorate and then get into government and carry those out. So we don't actually entertain discussion about what happens if we don't actually
In
win
Laurie
the election.
Penny's magazine, The New Statesman, he said, so you wouldn't work with Nick Clegg, he was asked, and Miliband replied, that's right, no.
Well, I'm sure that must be a misquote. I mean, he's worked with him on, for example, tackling the problems of all the phone hacking and, the Tories trying to rig the boundaries. So actually, when we've put forward a proposal which the Lib Dems are prepared to support, then they do work with us. But we want an overall majority.
Yeah. Laurie Penny, we've got to be coming to the end. I've got to rush this through. Laurie Penny.
Look, I think we should be quite clear that when we talk about this miraculous recovery that's happening for most people in this country, there has been no recovery whatsoever. Right here in Rochdale, unemployment has doubled since 2008, and it shows no signs of turning around.
But what about the election, which the question was about?
I'm coming to that.
Yeah, we have to speak up because we're coming to the end.
The Liberal Democrats have betrayed the electorate. They have betrayed the young people who voted for them in 2010. They have turned around... Come on. Clearly, they are behaving like... I'm sorry, you have no idea...
premium, school meals...
Shirley, you have no idea the sense of betrayal that young people and everybody who voted for the Liberal Democrats, not including myself, actually, in 2010, feels at this party.
Laurie,
it is not about mitigating what the Tories have done in government. You are legitimating what they've done. And on the major points... I'm sorry, may I finish? May I finish? On the major points, for example, tuition fees, there has been such a turnaround in what the Liberal Democrats are prepared to stand up for. Compromise that has sold out the most needy in this society.
All right.
No,
and I'm
look,
sorry,
I said pupil premium.
All right,
it is absolutely
I'm sorry.
How many more do you want me to list?
You're just getting started, but I've just got to stop you, Ken Clarke, very briefly, because we're out of time.
I'm a fan and a friend of Nick Clegg, and I think what separates Britain from other European countries who were in a desperate mess in 2010 is two parties put the national interest above their party interest, and this coalition has been extremely successful. But Nick has one fatal problem. He made a great speech at his conference, but what he's saying is who actually leads the government in the next party, in the next parliament, will be either Labour or Conservative, and it will be decided by those people who don't vote Liberal Democrat. If you vote for us, we're sitting in the centre, and it will all be decided by all the other voters. And we will go with whoever, whether the Labour Party or the Conservative parties, who get most votes. Same argument applies to Greens, UKIP, all these other people. And I'm afraid it's the awful dilemma of being a centre party that has plunged one way this time, but it does make it difficult to describe what on earth they're standing for.
We have to
really stop. In such a critical time.
We have to stop. Thank you very much. I'm sorry not to have brought any of you in on that last question, but you saw how it went. There was no space left. Our time's up, I'm afraid. We're going to be in Uxbridge next week, and we're going to be in Birmingham the week after that. So Uxbridge and Birmingham to take part. Do come, argue with our panellists, put questions to them. Go to our website or call 0330 123 9988. If you've been listening to this on Radio 5 Live, you can call in there and continue the debate on Question Time Extra Time. Thank you to our panel. Thank you very much indeed to all of you who invited us here to this wonderful town hall from Question Time in Rochdale. Until next Thursday. Good night.